So hello and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut Global Security Forum 2020, Battlefronts, New and Emerging Threats, Challenges, and Opportunities to Global Security. I'm Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it's my absolute pleasure today to open Global Security Forum. Each year, this annual event explores some of the most critical issues facing our nation and our world. And this year, we are going virtual, so even more people from around the world are joining us. I want to thank our sponsors, Pratt & Whitney and Lockheed Martin, for helping make all of this possible, and all of our partners that we work with throughout the year to make this happen. The Military Officers Association of America, the McCain Institute, the Connecticut Military Department, the Retired Officers Association, and our close partner, the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts. In addition, this year, because we're virtual, we have councils, World Affairs councils joining us from around the country. Councils from Cleveland, Houston, Maine, Cincinnati, Columbus, Ohio, Santa Fe, South Carolina, Upstate International, Pittsburgh, Colorado Springs, New Hampshire, Hawaii, Oregon, Kansas City, Kentucky, Boston, and Dallas, and I know there are a few more. I can't think of a better way to open the Global Security Forum than with Dr. Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, speaking about his new book, the New York Times bestseller, The World, A Brief Introduction. It's a great way to set the scene for all of the sessions that we'll hear this week. And I want to let everyone know, if you haven't purchased the book, there's a link to purchase the book in the chat. Today, the format will be an interactive discussion, interactive Q&A between Dr. Haass and our moderator, Bradley Akubuiro. Now, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a veteran and high-profile voice on foreign policy. He'll be in conversation today with Mr. Bradley Akubuiro, who is the chief spokesman and senior director of global media relations for Boeing. Before joining Boeing, Bradley was here at a Connecticut company, United Technologies, and Bradley has worked in countries around the world and brings extensive global experience to us today. Welcome, gentlemen. Bradley, I'll let you take it away.
Hey, first of all, thank you, Megan. The Global Security Forum is truly special, and it really is an honor to be here having this important discussion with a luminary like yourself, Dr. Haass. So let's jump right in. You published The World, A Brief Introduction, which became a New York Times bestseller. Some have described it as International Affairs 101, but how would you describe it, and why did the world need it now?
Well, thank you, Bradley. Thank you, Megan. It's great to be with you all. I wish the book hadn't been necessary. I could have spent more time working on my golf game or writing something else. Unfortunately, I think it is necessary. Look, on one hand, the world is objectively important. We're living with it every day. The repercussions of what began in Wuhan, China, that didn't stay local for long. Nothing stays local for long. 9/11, we just marked, the 19th anniversary of it. And in that case, it was terrorists trained in Afghanistan who killed 3,000 people in this country in a day. COVID-19, we've lost more than 200,000 lives in this country, 1 million people around the world. Climate change. Look at what California is going through in terms of fires. Look at what other parts of this country are going through in terms of storms and floods. So clearly the world matters in all sorts of ways. Yet my own reading of it, the situation is that a lot of Americans in particular don't see the connection, don't understand how the world and why the world affects the United States so much, and in turn, how what the United States does and doesn't do affects the world. And the reason that is, I think, is most Americans have not served in government, have not been in the military or worked at the State Department or the intelligence community. Most high schools do not offer courses about history of the world, the modern world, or foreign policy. Most colleges and universities do offer these courses, but they're almost never required. So you can graduate from any of the elite universities or the non-elite universities in this country and pretty much navigate your distribution requirements. So you will have learned nothing about the world, that you'll essentially leave the campus, and I don't mean this to be mean-spirited, but illiterate about this world you're entering, and that will affect your life in so many ways. You can turn on the morning television shows on the networks or the nightly news on the network, and most days, again, you'll get nothing about the international situation. You can go on the internet, and for sure you can find good stuff about the world. The problem is you can find all sorts of other stuff that's way off base, that's inaccurate, and there's no one there with little yellow post-it saying, read this, but don't read that. So the reason I felt compelled to write this book was to try to do my piece, my bit, in narrowing the gap between what I thought Americans and others needed to know about the world, about why it matters, how it affects their lives, how it operates, and what it is they did know. And this is my attempt. And my goal is essentially to bring about citizens who are more informed. I mean, I thought it was quite telling. Sorry to go on so long, Bradley, but tonight is the first debate. There are 6 sets of questions. Guess what doesn't figure in them? There's none of the questions that's exclusively devoted to either the world or to American foreign policy. We're not voting for mayor of the United States in early November. We're electing the next president, the next commander in chief. So again, I'm struck by the lack of attention, by the lack of focus. But whoever it is we elect in November, he will have extraordinary impact on the world, which in turn will have extraordinary impact on us. And my goal again is to make citizens more informed, so when they do vote, they have these issues in the forefront of their mind. They can make informed votes. Also, though, when they make business decisions, investment decisions, career decisions, travel decisions, I believe people need to have this under their belt. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, I'm sorry this book was necessary, but I really think it is.
It's a really interesting set of points. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about this is you wrote this book before the pandemic hit, right? And you wrote about the risk of a global pandemic. 2 questions. 1, how did you know? But 2, do you think this experience with the global pandemic is going to further reinforce this isolation you're talking about and that mindset? Or do you think that this is going to force us into an increased understanding of the role of globalization?
The reason I knew about it, let me just say at the outset, I wasn't the only one who called it. Bill Gates did. A lot of people in the intelligence community and the US government did. And the reason it wasn't so hard is that we had what? A century ago, we had the so-called Spanish flu. But then more recently, we had all sorts of infectious diseases, from SARS to Ebola to MERS, and so forth. So the idea that something infectious could break out and then get on the, if you will, the multiple highways of globalization didn't seem to me to be a reach. It was really one of those, it's a question of when it happens, not if it happens. It's a question of how strong the strain is, how virulent it was. But I thought it was, again, not exceptional. Obviously, I didn't know exactly when it was going to break out, but you know, this time it was COVID-19. There'll be a COVID-22 or 25. There could be at some point bacteria that emerge that are resistant to antibiotics. I think this is now part and parcel of living in a global world. The question, you know, is there a silver lining here? Look, I'd love to sit here, Bradley, and say, sure, that we in the world will learn the lessons and we will be better prepared either to stave off the next pandemic or if and when it does happen, to cope with it. So far fewer people come down with the disease, far fewer people lose their lives because of it. But so far, at least, here we are, what, 9 or so months into it. It's hard to be an optimist. The World Health Organization has not been reformed or improved. The United States has left the World Health Organization without suggesting what should be put in its place. The world has not come together in terms of coming up with a vaccine or vaccines. We haven't agreed upon how they will be distributed and to whom. What we're seeing instead is it's really a contradiction almost. Here you have this global challenge. And what we're seeing is that certain individual countries, by the way, some democracies, some authoritarian, some are doing really well and some are doing terribly. So what we're learning is what really matters is national leadership, not the nature of the system. But again, we've seen a largely national response to an international challenge. So I'd love to sit here again and say, we're going to learn the lessons, and as we say about genocide, never again. But, genocides keep happening and the world doesn't do much. And my fear is that the world will not learn the lessons from this, or even if it learns it intellectually, the world will not put those lessons into place. So I'd love to be proven wrong. Good news is I'm wrong all the time. But by and large, one of the hallmarks of the era we live in is the prevalence and significance of these global challenges, from disease to climate change to what have you. And in virtually every instance, the world is falling short. People in my business often use the phrase international community. I wish there were one. That's all I can say. But that's aspirational. In the meantime, we're not coming together, and I'm not wildly optimistic that we'll either learn the collective, that we'll learn the same lessons. It's almost like wars. After a war is fought, people say, well, what are the lessons of that war? And then we fight a political war over the lessons. So my guess is there may not be a consensus even about what is to be learned or what is to be done. And a lot of countries and others are going to push back, even though it's in their own self-interest to be better prepared for the next time this comes along.
No, that's fair. And I think it's easy for folks to say, all right, an understanding of global affairs is important for our leaders. But you talk about global literacy and that being a minimum standard that folks should be able to understand about the world around us. Can you just talk a little bit about what role does global literacy have in global security?
Look, for leaders, I would love that political leaders around the world have the basic history. It's interesting. If you go back to somebody like President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was probably the moment in the early 60s where the world came the closest it's ever come to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. Kennedy was informed by history. He had read Barbara Tuchman's book about the events of August 1914, about the breakout of World War I. And he was really mindful about how World War I happened less out of design than because of events. In some ways, it was, I described it in this book as a war of carelessness. Didn't have to happen, but it was brought about by a cavalcade of events. And Kennedy basically say, I will do everything possible to see that a world war in the nuclear age does not begin that way. That to me is the example of why history matters. Or when I was advising the 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush the father, and the United States had led the world in resisting Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. We had by early 91 liberated Kuwait, and the president and I and Brent Scowcroft had a conversation about what should be American war aims. And I was able to talk about what happened to Truman in Korea. And if people don't know the history, in 1950, after North Korea invaded South Korea, the United States, working with the UN, liberated South Korea, and then, though, went north of the original border, the de facto border at the 38th parallel, and tried to reunify the entire peninsula by force. And ultimately, Chinese forces came into the war, and tens of thousands of Americans died in that later phase of the war. And I said to President Bush, that's the risk of expanding your war aims in the flush of victory. Do we really want to go on to Baghdad? Do we really want to take that on? And we talked about it, and for lots of reasons, the president decided not to. And I would just say that the subsequent Iraq War in 2003, led by the 43rd president, shows some of the dangers of having gotten ambitious in Iraq. And so again, I feel that history is important for leaders. I feel that history is important for those who advise them. I feel that history is important for citizens. There's a lot of history about isolationism, protectionism, and a lot of parallels. History doesn't repeat itself, but as Mark Twain said, it rhymes. And if there are things to be learned and things to be applied, it's obviously in our interest to do so. So I would want citizens and those they put into office to be armed with history, with an understanding of the world, both the lessons of history, what to expect of certain institutions. I mean, for example, sorry to go on so long again, but we have this thing called the United Nations. Well, one would have to ask the question, what is realistic to expect of the United Nations? How much of our faith or security should we put in its basket? And we may decide precious little based upon what the history could do. So again, I find history of all sorts really the single most useful guidepost I can find in terms of, it's not exact, making policy is not the same as baking a cake. There's no recipes. But there again, I think there are lessons that are instructive for helping us sort through the news and the challenges we face every day.
There are many domains, or to use, the theme of the Global Security Forum, battlefronts, whether you think about climate change, trade policy, technology, so many different domains. Are there any that you think are most critical to global security? And then on the other side of that, simultaneously, are there any that you feel like Americans in particular understand the least or are less literate?
Good questions. Look, let me take one step back. I think what makes this period of history qualitatively different is the emergence of what these global domains, as you call them. There's a lot of history about great power rivalry and competitions, great power wars. I mean, think about the last century, 2 world wars and a Cold War. And now we've got competition and rivalry between the US and Russia, US and China. Okay, that's kind of the familiar stuff of history. What's so different about this era of history is what you describe as these domains, whether it's climate change, infectious disease, the cyberspace, cyber domain proliferation, trade. These are all manifestations of globalization. These are all global challenges. I think they're all critical. I worry particularly about climate change because there I think the gap between the challenge and the collective response is large and it's growing. And I think the repercussions, as much now as we're dealing with the problems of COVID, I think the day is likely to come when we're dealing with the problems of climate change, and they are every bit as far reaching and as consequential. And I'm worried that we're not even close to doing what we need to do, either as a country or as a world. And again, in every one of these places, I'm struck by the gap between, again, the challenge and the arrangements or the institutions in place. In the case of cyber, here we are, we're about to go to the polls in a month, and there's no framework for, among other things, how major powers ought to act. And so we have Russia and others interfering in our elections, using cyber as their domain, and it's happening. And we're vulnerable there. We're not pushing back nearly enough to deter it or to stop it, and that tells me something. So I don't know how to say which is the most critical right now. Infectious disease and the lack of an effective global public health framework. Clearly, the World Health Organization failed early on in this crisis in say December, January, February. But if I had to say everywhere, we've got some things in place on terror, some things in place on trade, some things in place on proliferation. They're inadequate. At least there's some things in place. Where I'm most worried about, given the gap between what's done and what needs doing and the significance of the threat, I would probably say I'm most worried about climate change.
Great. You also, Dr. Haass, write about the critical role of global leadership. Do you think the world is more secure when the U.S. asserts global leadership? And can you assess maybe for us the trajectory of U.S. leadership on the world stage today?
Look, the short answer is yes, but leadership is not acting unilaterally. Leadership implies followership. It implies partnership. So, which I think is critical. I mean, if I have 2 points in this book, one is that isolationism is folly. We can run, but we can't hide from the world. The world will find us. And second is there's nothing we can do better by ourselves than we can do with others. So yes, American leadership, but American leadership in partnership with others. And for 75 years, the United States has been leading. Again, not acting alone, but leading with our allies and partners in Europe and in Asia in particular. And I think it's been an extraordinary run of history. Indeed, it is the single most extraordinary run of history in history, in terms of the avoidance of 75 years of great power conflict, Cold War stayed cold. By the way, it ended on terms favorable to us. The average standard of living around the world has gone up astronomically, dozens and dozens of times. The average person in this country lives about a decade longer. In some parts of the world, the average person lives 20 or 30 years longer. Far more people are living in democracies. All sorts of measures. It really has been an extraordinary run of history, and good things just don't happen. The reason it happened is the United States took the lead after World War II, stayed involved in the world, resisted isolationism, and created these alliances, created these international institutions, and then didn't just create them, but then made them work, both architect and general contractor. So we stayed involved in the world. If we stop doing this, and there's some signs that we are, clearly there's a lack of consensus in this country now about whether we ought to continue being so involved in the world. I worry the world will not self-organize. It's a little bit like high school, I guess it was chemistry or physics. Systems just don't happen. The natural tendency of things is to unravel. I think that randomness or entropy, things come apart. Centrifugal forces are quite powerful. So it took the United States acting and leading to resist those centrifugal forces. And without us, I worry the centrifugal forces will gain the upper hand. I don't see anyone else willing and able to play this role. Some other countries might be interested, like the Europeans, but they lack the capacity, the power. Countries like China or Russia have their own vision of the world, but it's not one that's in our interest. It's very much in their interest, but our interests diverge significantly. So I simply think good things will not happen without us. And what we're beginning to see in some of the, again, domains, to use your word, that we've already discussed, is things are moving in the wrong direction. The gap, again, between responses and challenges is not only large, but it's growing in a world in which the United States pulls back and essentially says, we're not prepared to play this role anymore. I think the world begins to unravel. And second of all, we pay a price for it. That's my basic point. If bad things happen out there, I think the lesson of everything from COVID-19 to climate to terrorism to what have you is bad things don't stay there. Nothing stays local for long. These two oceans we find ourselves sandwiched by, the Atlantic and Pacific, they're not moats. Things cross these oceans. Again, whether it's computer viruses or physical viruses or terrorists or missiles. And not only bad things, good things. Could be emails, it could be trade, could be tourists, so good things. So what we need to do is try to structure things so the good parts of globalization thrive. And we need to structure things so the dangerous parts of globalization, we push back against them. But it doesn't just happen by itself. And at the moment, I don't see a substitute for us.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Haass, I work for Boeing. Raytheon Technologies has a big presence in the state of Connecticut as the Sikorsky. If you think from defense contractors to technology companies across the board, what role does industry play in helping achieve a secure, globalized world?
I think industry plays an enormous role. We think of foreign policy and international relations as about countries. And yes, only countries have seats in the UN General Assembly. I lost count. I think there's 193 right now. But if you use the old cliche of a chessboard, it's not just governments or countries. You've got, for example, if you're talking about global health, how can you talk about global health without talking about drug companies, biotech, or the Gates Foundation, or the Bloomberg Foundation? These are powerful actors in the area of global health, or cyber. If you want to regulate cyberspace, how are you going to do it without Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter, Microsoft, and so forth? These are major players in that space. So I think increasingly in the future, we've got to think of public-private partnerships, either at home or abroad. If you're looking at defense and security, obviously the military is a central critical tool of America's defense. So companies, whether it's Lockheed or Raytheon or any of the probably thousands of also smaller companies in the IT space and so forth, play a critical role. Government can, I think, rally, can organize, can focus. And there's some things only government can do. And governments have certain authority and legitimacy because they're accountable to citizens. But governments can't do it all. Governments need partners. And just like we need international partners, other countries, we need domestic partners. I mean, take one of the hot issues in the field, which is dealing with China in the technology space. A lot of people are justifiably concerned about China either stealing certain technologies or stealing information through it when they provide the so-called pipes, the systems. Okay, so we don't like Huawei providing the 5G network. Okay, well, you can't beat something with nothing. So we need industry, corporate world in this country and in Europe, say, or in Asia, to come together to provide an alternative. So to me, it doesn't do a lot of good just to complain about Huawei and about China unless we have come up with a situation where the private sector has put forward an alternative. And the private sector can often best do that if it's given clear guidance and consistent guidance from government about standards and so forth. And companies can make investments. Like in the automobile industry, basically everyone in Detroit has always said, look, you tell us what the regulatory framework is, what kind of mileage per gallon and so forth, what kind of standards do we have to meet? We'll meet them. Let's set some reasonable rules, even ambitious rules, but we want to be part of that process, but let's then agree, and then we can work within that system. We can live up to them. So I think public-private partnerships are an essential part of success, whether it's domestic or international.
Great. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from the audience here, and one here from Ambassador Charles Shapiro. In March of 2018, when you spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations in Atlanta, in response to a question, you said that you did not think that the U.S. was experiencing a constitutional crisis. Are we in one now?
It's good to hear from Ambassador Shapiro, but let me just point out, it's really unfair when people quote you back to yourself. And I think that ought to be off limits, or at least there ought to be a statute of limitations. We could be in a constitutional crisis. We'll know better in the next 2 months, but we're certainly in a political crisis in the sense that our politics have become increasingly dysfunctional. The partisan divide, Justice Brandeis once said that governments were not meant to meet the standard of efficiency. But we have taken that point to a level he never imagined. And we've become so dysfunctional at the national or federal level. So little can get accomplished now that I think we've had a political crisis for years in terms of partisanship. And so many of the challenges of this country are not being met, whether it's infrastructure, our inability to come up with a sensible immigration system, locally and around the country, the crisis in public education. People stand around US consulates around the world wanting to get visas to go to American universities. No one lines up outside an American consulate to go to an inner city public school. But public school is the one thing, K through 10 or K through 12 is the one thing we know every American experiences. And we can't, our inability to improve our schools, to me, is a real scandal. And it's to me, in some ways, the biggest challenge to making the American dream not a slogan, but a reality. So I think we've had a political crisis for years in this country. I think the question now of whether we also have a constitutional crisis. And by the way, my listing of things in the political crisis would also include race and other issues. I was just speaking in shorthand. I apologize. But now, whether we could have a constitutional crisis, sure, about depressing voter turnout, I think is a real issue. I think about how ballots are counted, the fairness of an election, been a lot of attention to the whole question of the peaceful transfer of power, respect for the courts, respect for the rule of law. It turns out, what's so interesting about our Constitution, it's something we all, I won't say we all, but many of us underestimated. That you've got the Constitution, you've got the 24+ amendments, you've got all the laws that are on the books. It turns out, though, a big part of what makes this system works, what kind of gives it lubrication, what gives it cushion, so it isn't brittle, so it doesn't break down, are norms. It's all the things that you often can't legislate, you can't turn into formal statutes, but there's kind of understandings. And this is what actually makes the system what makes politics work. And it builds in a willingness to compromise, certain types of accountability, certain understandings of the limits of authority and power. And I think we have a crisis there. I do. And I think we're being tested as never before. I'd like to be an optimist, so, fine. But whether I'm an optimist or not is irrelevant. I think we're being tested. And I think the next couple of months could be truly, promise to be truly consequential. And one of the lessons I take from this is beyond navigating through what could be an extraordinarily difficult aftermath to this election. And I worry that a big slice of this country will not accept the outcome as legitimate. I worry about that, and I worry about the implications and repercussions of that, not just in the courts and in the institutions of governance, but also in the streets. I can't sit here and dismiss the possibility of violence, but even if we are lucky enough to get through the next few months, essentially together, I think we ought to take it as a real warning, and not assume that if we do get through it this time, that somehow we're safe. It's like canoeing. Just because we get through these rapids, we shouldn't assume there aren't going to be future rapids. And one of the lessons I take, and I've been talking a lot about global literacy, I think one of the real requirements for our country has to be to build civics literacy. I think the lesson I take from all this is that we shouldn't assume that the DNA of American democracy, this American political experiment, is widely understood or even universally accepted. So I take this as a kind of warning that rather than being sanguine, that support in this country, in this society, for American democracy, understanding about why it's valuable, appreciation of what it takes to work. I don't assume that that's nearly as embedded as it needs to be. So what I would hope coming out of this, you asked before about coming out, say, of a pandemic, will we improve our global health machinery? I hope so, but I don't know. I'm also hope that coming out of this political and constitutional crisis, that we improve not just our machinery, but our approach to American politics.
Great. I have a quick question from you, from Scott Wilson. What is Putin's succession plan?
Well, the answer is there is none, as best we know. My hunch is Mr. Putin, as Bob Gates once says, plans to stay in power until he's carried out feet first. So that might be I don't know if that's a succession plan, but that's probably his resignation plan. That he is there essentially for the indefinite future, or maybe the definite future. I think he's there until he can't function anymore. One of the hallmarks of authoritarian systems, and particularly ones that aren't monarchies, is that power, there's no concept of legitimacy when it comes to ruling and power, but it's fought for and struggled over every time. So Mr. Putin has usurped power. There's no acceptance of it in the positive sense. So if and when he were to die or become incapacitated, I assume the stage is set for a struggle. And he's created a kind of a kleptocracy, a small group of people who hold inordinate wealth, who essentially cluster around him. Now, whether he will be able to pass that on to another individual, I don't know. I am skeptical. But all sorts of things could happen at that point. You could have another strongman. The idealist or optimist would say that would be Russia could begin a transition to a real democracy as opposed to a faux democracy. You could have breakdown of order. I don't even assume that the future of Russia as an integrated country is a given the lack of a real economy, given that there's enormous chunks of territory that are under or unpopulated, given the minorities issues, local nationalisms. So I think Russia's future, I think ultimately, my guess is, I haven't said this in public before, but let's say it. Right now, Mr. Putin is someone who's played a bad hand very well for all of Russia's weaknesses and limits. He's had an outsized role in European security, in the Middle East, interfering with American elections. But I think where he will fail is in institutionalizing any future for his country. And getting to the question, I think he will probably fail in institutionalizing any succession that'll be stable or lasting or legitimate. So I think it's quite possible, if that's the case, that Mr. Putin, his legacy will be seen as a really negative one. That one day future people in his country and around the world will see him not just as this authoritarian figure who poisons his political opponents, who hasn't created a modern economy, who uses force indiscriminately in parts of Europe and the Middle East. In addition to all that, he might be seen in he sees the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, the end of the loss of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I don't think it's inconceivable that he could be seen as the person one day who leads to the fragmentation of Russia itself. And so I think Mr. Putin's legacy, shall we say, is up for grabs.
No, that's great. I have one final kind of two-part question for you as we close out here, but the first part of it comes in from Monica Molina, who asks, isn't the dumbing down of our educational system a particular goal of certain political groups in order to make the public more easy to manipulate? And I think the reverse side of that question also is, in a world in which the global literacy that you envision is a reality, what does that look like?
Look, I don't know if people have an agenda to quote unquote dumb down. I have an agenda which is to smarten up. And my own view is a lot of the poor quality of American education is not planned. It's simply the outcome of the kind of teacher training we do, how we pay for public education. Too much of it's based upon local property taxes, teachers unions. In many cases, outcomes aren't planned. They're just that, they're outcomes. And this is an outcome that in many cases does not serve young people well or the society well at all. And I think the challenge, and it kind of gets to the second question, what do we do about it? And what I would argue is we need a national, and again, I know I'm bucking the wind here, going against the trend, but I do think we need national standards in some things. I don't think, if the goal is to create a more cohesive country, a country where we can work together and get things done, why would we want there to be different civics taught in Arkansas than in Oregon, or in Texas than in Florida or New York? The last I checked, we only have one constitution. So we have a common history. And so my goal is to come up with, in that sense, a common national civics curriculum at the national. That doesn't mean people can't teach local history or state history in addition, but I do think we ought to try to settle on what our collective experience is. But again, it's important to remember this country, this is not a country founded on religion. This is a country founded on an idea. Now, obviously, we didn't, for centuries, live up to those ideas, and in some cases, we still don't live up to ideas. I understand that. But this is a country based on an idea. And it seems to me it's imperative that we try to teach that, and then we can have serious conversations about what's the best way to make the idea or the ideas that the country is founded on, to make them reality. And I think that's where politics come in. And I think, look, more broadly, we need to think about what's a modern education. I'm struck by how many people shell out incredible sums of money to send their sons or daughters either to private schools or to colleges and universities without spending the time to think about what the curriculum is, what's required, what is this piece of parchment they're going to get after however many years represent. And I would hope that people would get much more involved and think about what it is we're getting for our investment of time and money. Maybe, just maybe, Bradley, out of the current situation, which is so disrupting higher education, there might be a bit of a sorting out. More schools will choose to define themselves as to what they are really going to offer to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. But I think we need to think really hard about what kind of skills we need, critical thinking, writing, speaking, and so forth, and then what kind of knowledge we need. and I would argue, two sets of knowledge we need, and we've been talking about them here. One is global literacy, and one is civics literacy, in addition to whatever knowledge we may need in the way of math or computer science or what have you. But that to me is a worthy conversation about how we make ourselves, prepare our citizens of the future, how we make ourselves competitive, how we give people the foundation so they can get through the next 40 or 50 years of their working lives and essentially have the skill set, the foundation they need to deal with the inevitable challenges that are come their way. But that's the conversation we ought to be having about education in this country.
Dr. Haass, this has been a tremendous conversation. Really appreciate your time today. And Megan, I will turn it back over to you.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Haass, for sharing your insight, your knowledge, this sobering view of the world that we're sitting in. And hopefully we can all consider everything that you said today as we go forward in this week in the Global Security Forum 2020. And as we listen tonight to the presidential debate and sort of hear the lack of foreign policy that you talked about. I want to encourage everybody again to get the book. There's a link in the chat to get The World, A Brief Introduction. Bradley, thank you. Master moderator. I also want to remind everybody that we have a full day at Global Security Forum tomorrow. We start bright and early at 9 a.m. with a fireside chat with Ambassador Kurt Volker and Luke Knidig from the McCain Institute. We move on to a great Defense Allies panel with some of our defense attaches from the Five Eyes countries. We move on again to a Battlefronts panel that is going to discuss some of the most pressing security opportunities and challenges that we have, that Dr. Haass laid out some of those today. And then we'll finish the evening with a panel discussion on how we end our forever wars. For more information, please visit gsf2020.com. Again, gsf2020.com. Dr. Haass, Bradley, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you everyone in the audience. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Megan. Stay safe and well, everybody.